Now we're going to listen Juan Camilo Restrepo. He comes from Javeriana University. He's a specialist on economic law, and he's a doctor from administrative law from the University of Paris. He has been a teacher for Andes University, Externado, and Arboleda. He has worked with the mining ministry. He has been an ambassador for Colombia and France. You're welcome. Good morning, everyone. I'm very much pleased to be able to participate in this very important venue for reflection related to our restitution processes, land restitution processes. Our moderator has indicated to us that this module, this part of the day, is going to be dedicated to the analysis of the different structural aspects of the restitution processes as related to other processes, not only international but also internal processes within Colombia. So I'm going to use my 20 minutes, with your permission, to have a comparison done between what we have as point number one in the Havana agenda dedicated to agrarian policy, urban development, and land access, which has already been negotiated. I think 2 years ago that negotiation was finalized. That was the very first point negotiated. And then the restitution process, land restitution process here in Colombia. When you first look at it, the two are processes which do not have a link, a direct link between each other, because land restitution itself, the one we have been talking about this morning, that process here in Colombia has not been subjected to any negotiation in the negotiation tables in Havana, because this is part of a law 1448 from 2011, which was approved before the negotiations at Havana started, and as any valid law, they have to be lived by. They are not negotiated. Nevertheless, as the professor just mentioned it, the professor before me for this South African case, all these policies related to land, they are all part of a general purpose, a broader purpose, which is a reconciliation process and a peace building in the country. All analysts from the right, from the middle, from the left, recent or old, everyone analyzing the Colombian conflict, they all say the same thing. The root of the conflict is related to the agrarian conflict. So whatever is trying to resolve, or maybe moderate or mitigate this agrarian conflict, they are all part of a reconciliation project and peace building project that we have to put together here in Colombia. So I want to repeat myself, even though law 1468 related to land restitution, even though this is not part of the negotiation process at Havana, they are part anyway of land restitution efforts and the negotiation. They are very much linked. They are very much related to peace building and living together as Colombians. I'm going to talk about the first agreement in the agenda at Havana, and then I'm going to talk about some other topics related to the way land restitution has been working so far here in Colombia. When we started preparing something that later on became the agenda, negotiation agenda in Havana, we were very careful about FARC being a guerrilla group that has always had a very clear route on our rural areas, our farming areas. When you look about the ideology of FARC for the last 50 years, you always find as a center point agrarian issues as part of their political and military agenda. And they always talked about this, and the government accepted it. The government accepted that the agrarian issues were going to be paramount in the negotiations, and that's why the point number one was dedicated in the negotiations to rural changes and land access in Colombia. The negotiation of that point number one was done very carefully. It wasn't done in a rush. We didn't do it based on any other issues. We didn't do this violating any judicial structure put in place by the Colombian government. And it took us a year and a half to negotiate that very first point in Havana. That point is there, ready to start developing itself within the framework that nothing has been negotiated unless everything is negotiated. So we are now negotiating the very last point, and after we negotiate that, we are going to start with the execution of all these agreements. And the number one agreement, as I told you before, is the agrarian issues. So we have been very open about negotiations. We have not negotiated anything under the table. Agreement on item number one. We have distributed about 5 million copies of that agreement through electronic media, through printed copies, and nevertheless, groups who do not want a peace in Colombia, they keep on insisting that they do not know what was negotiated in Havana. They say that we handed over the country to Timochenko, one of the guerrilla group members. And people who do not want peace in Colombia, they say that our negotiations are hidden from the public. That's false. That agreement has been signed by both parties, and it has been very openly disseminated, and it's going to be executed after the last point of the negotiation agenda is done with. We hope it's very soon. So what's the agrarian agreement that we came that we were able to close in Havana? So this consists of something very simple but very important. We have a commitment there to create a land fund, which, even though hasn't been quantified in the agreement itself, we have estimated that this fund could be about 3 or 4 million hectares big, which should be distributed according to the agreement to landless farmers or to people who do not have enough land to live adequately. This is not an agreement with FARC members. This is an agreement with the Colombian population as the constitution dictates. This is an agreement to move on to a process that will enable us to distribute the land in Colombia. That land fund or territory fund, which was a means to create a formal commitment. It is very different in some issues, in some topics, in some aspects to the agrarian reforms that we had in Latin America back in the second half of the 20th century. I'm going to explain to you what the differences are, but this agreement has a very similar purpose. The agreements talk about transformation, an integral rural transformation. What's different between this agreement and the normal or regular agrarian reforms that we had last century in Latin America, which were not very successful, by the way? Those reforms consisted of an institute that was created. Here in Colombia, we call it INCORA, and that institution, based on the budget that was assigned to it on a yearly basis, that budget was very epileptic based on our fiscal situation. That fund went to the market to buy some land. The market was not very stable back then, and there was expropriation to very few expropriation, but what we were talking about back then was acquisition of land using public resources. Many of those pieces of land bought by Incora were handed over, as it was said before, it was handed over as empty land. That's very different to the agreement that we came to at Havana. The agreement in Havana is based on a different fact. Even though land access or access to land is very difficult and some people do not have enough land to work with, access to land is land. We are not only talking about giving away territory, we're talking about all these other things that are required, and this is the first difference when compared to older agrarian reforms. The other difference is that the agrarian fund negotiated at Havana is going to have several paths, several sources to nourish itself, to give away land in order to create this policy related to handing over land to people who do not have enough land or don't have any land at all. Not having enough land, those words are repeated in the agreement because, as you know, in Colombia, the structure of land has two different aspects which are apparently contradictory, but they are there anyway. First of all, owning land in Colombia has gone through a period of big concentration, especially after the narco-trafficking groups acquiring the best land in the country, in the valley and in Magdalena. But we also have a dual structure related to having an asphyxiating system that does not help any farming families, especially in Nariño, Boyacá, Cundinamarca, and Antioquia. It's not very easy for people to own land and to make it productive. So to give land to people who do not have it or who do not have enough, the commitment there is to break away from those two problems that our agrarian structure has. Not having enough land or not having any land at all, not owning it. That's what we are going to try to deal with. The fund is going to nourish itself from several different structures that were not used by Incora in the past. They are going to be able to buy land as Incora did it before. That's part of the agreement. It's mentioned there. But not only that, and this is a very important item to highlight, that fund is going to nourish itself from the recovery of land that the country, the government is going to undergo. We're talking about lots that do not have an owner or lots that have been taken away from the government by different illegal means. The people that have been displaced from land, they have not only been farmers or peasants, people living in rural areas. The government has also been displaced from land without specific proprietor, and the government has not been displaced by force. They have been displaced through the notary public offices, through government institutions. So that job of recovering 2 million hectares to make it work in a social way through this fund, that's one of the main or paramount issues, part of this Havana agreement. Last night, the Constitutional Court produced a judgment saying that they were going to monitor specifically that recovery effort, land recovery effort. We have a lot of interests involved there. Some of them cannot be even can even be mentioned. They are now trying to get rid of the agrarian policy, and now that we're talking about recovering land that belong to the government. We're not only talking about recovering that kind of land. Here in Colombia, going back to the presidency of Dr. Lleras, there was a law 1958 from 1959, and they generated some of forest interest areas. Out of those areas, it's about 2 million hectares. We are talking about over 2 million. We're talking about over 2 million hectares where we don't have a tree. Entire cities such as Valledupar, they have been built on areas covered by law number 2. And the fact that they are part of that jurisdiction, it implies that you cannot give away law or you cannot give property rights at all, even though there is no a reserve. So now we're talking about having to go through a breakdown for 2 million hectares. 2 million hectares out of the 8 million hectares protected by law 1959. 2 million out of these 8 million are going to be it's going to be possible for these pieces of land to be handed over as part of this Havana agreement. Second, I already mentioned this back in by the end of the last century, there was a process, some 400 or 500,000 hectares, which were bought by narco trafficking forces or interests related to these forces. So this land is now under the charge of the anti-trafficking office. So what we have to do now is go through the process of analyzing what land we can handle through this office, and then we remove the property from these people. After that, that's going to be part of this Havana agreement. But there are interests. There are people who do not want to take this all the way there. This land is the best land in the country. I want to emphasize that they have gone like airplanes go to the Bermuda Triangle. You know when they go in, but you don't know when they go out. So they are part of this process now. They have been there for a long time. They have to be taken out of this process, so they are taken to this Havana agreement aim. After this is done, this is covered by the Constitution decades ago. It's not like the people who do not want peace in Colombia, what they're saying is that this is not constitutional. They are coming up with reasons for this not to take place. So yet the removal of the property rights is covered by the Constitution, even more so if these lands are going to be taken to this fund or if they are going to be used for any other reason. So as you can see, the different sources of land for this Havana Agreement is very broad. We need very strong institutions to implement that policy. I am concerned, it is a big concern that the institution or the institutions related to rural development in Colombia, they're very weak. That's a very big concern. Encoder, the old encoder, it's dying. That institution is actually dying, and they are going to be relieved by two different entities, one dedicated to land and the other one dedicated to rural development. They are only being born, and as you know very well, here in Colombia, while an institution is born, while they get enough muscle to act, while they get enough strength to do what they have to do, especially when we talk about rural issues, it could take about 1 or 2 years. So the big question is what's going to happen institutionally during these 1 or 2 years. So the Havana Agreement takes into consideration several things. Just to mention a few, it foresees the creation of a agrarian jurisdiction inspired on the successful experience that we've had with the agrarian judges when we talk about the restitution process. And there is also going to be a program to formalize agrarian property, FARC. They changed their view, their perspective. This is perspective that's very interesting. If you look at the speech from Marquez in Oslo, you can read what he said at the beginning. He was against this, giving deeds to people who do not have property. He said that was going to be a means to take away the property from farmers, from people in rural areas. Then the FARC signed this agreement where we talk about a mass commitment, a massive effort to give property to people who do not have property of their land. It's been calculated that 50% of the property, rural property exploited in Colombia, they are not registered properly. The registration is not proper, so people who do not register their property do not have access to loans, to subsidies and social security. That's going to be remedied with this effort. Now, I know now I don't have a lot of time, so we have the land restitution policy, which is paramount in this seminar. First off, I think it's worth mentioning, it's not as bad, it's not doing as bad as some people say in terms of how quickly it's working. The land restitution policy designed by Law 1468 is based on the fact that this is a judicial process and the person with the last word on restitution is a judge, a judge from the circuit. This is not an administration decision, not an administrative decision. We don't want to be random. It will be random if an office from the government will was to receive the claims, and on the other end, the same office will be handing over the deeds. The transitional justice in which this law is based foresees that the government is going to accompany the claimants up to the last stage of the process, and it also foresees several guarantees. Just to mention one, for example, whoever at the beginning of a claim process believes to have, if this person believes they have a better claim than the original claimant, they can have their evidence admitted, and if the judge thinks that the claim has legal validity, that a claim is going to be considered even before the original one. So 50% of the sentences of the judgments have been in favor of the original claimants. We have had 20,000 claims in total. This is good to differentiate. This is very good, a very good thing to do. Some people talk about 300,000 families. When we were first studying, when we were looking at the judges before the instrument was created, we went to the numbers available in Colombia at that point. These figures were gathered through the effort from the church in Colombia in rural areas, and we realized that, or we were thinking about 350,000 families that may have been dispossessed of their land, or maybe they had to abandon them. So those were the original figures, and that's what we used to design our instrument. But the land restitution law itself, and this is a very important point, that law itself does not have any goals, because the only goal it has is to service as many claims as they are raised. And how are they going to be serviced? They are going to be not admitted because they are not part of they are not admitted as a result of the process. If we're talking about a claim of a dispossession before 1991, that's the responsibility of the land restitution office not to consider it. Or maybe this is not related to a dispossession, it is more related to some issues or lawsuits related to some land management. 25% of the claims, not 21.3%. 25% of these claims have been solved either by not being admitted, or because they do not follow due process, or because the agrarian judges have produced a judgment and they are now, and the rest are now being handled by the judges. Another topic, another issue which is important, is that law provisions that these claims could not be taken to the agrarian judges unless there was a green light from the military forces or law enforcement. The argument was that farmers could not go and claim for some land where we still had conflict between the military forces, the police, and the guerrilla groups, or because we had some demining efforts that had to take place before they could go there. So the first issue was already solved, and that problem related to problems between military forces, police, and guerrilla groups. We were talking about 50% of the claims. They are now going to the judges, and we're going to have a very good turnaround after this is materialized. But I want to say this again, there are no goals. We want to service as many claims as they come up. 90,000, some people talk about that. When hearing the person before me, we are talking about 20,000 here in Colombia, and in South Africa we had 80,000 claims. So we are talking about the same numbers, I think. This land restitution law and effort, which is regularly applied after the conflict, as in the case of South Africa. Here in Colombia, we made the decision to do land restitution when the conflict is still ongoing. And that's why some of the difficulties are explained. That's how some of the difficulties arise. And Just to finish with, the process is showing that the judicial instruments could be adapted to our situation as we move along. So we have two agrarian policies, the agreement number one from Havana and land restitution. Even though the second one is not part of the first one, of the negotiation of the first one, it's part of the bigger picture, of the bigger purpose of laying a solid, robust basis to the solution of the agrarian issues in Colombia. This is a very important condition for peace to be a reality, because what we're going to see in a few weeks after the signing of the peace agreements, that's only the beginning. That's only going to be the beginning. That's when everything starts, not when everything finishes. That's where the post-conflict situation comes in, and that's where the agrarian policy comes in too, which is a complement to